Okay, hi and welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us at this event that we have as part of our Transformative Play Initiative series at Uppsala University at the Department of Game Design. I am Josefin Westborg, and I'm a research assistant at Uppsala University and part of the TPI, Transformative Play Initiative. And I will be your host tonight. And we are super happy to be able to introduce to you our speaker for tonight, that I first met at a night out many years ago when I was wearing a folk costume, and she was wearing this gorgeous yellow dress that is still etched into my mind. But I also want to give you some more relevant background than her fabulous fashion sense, so I will also share with you her bio. Johanna Koljonen, co-founder of the Participation Design Agency, is an experienced designer, theorist, and strategic consultant, and an expert in designing for safe and enthusiastic participation. She lectures internationally on participatory storytelling and on the future of the audiovisual industries, as well as advising both cultural institutions and public and private sector clients on participation and immersive experiences. She is also an occasional writer of drama, comics, and digital games, and she serves on the board of the Swedish Film Institute. In 2011, she received the Swedish Grand Journalism Award in the Innovator category. And her latest book is the edited anthology LARP Design Creating Role-Playing Experiences that came out in 2019. She is also a very well-known person within the Nordic Larp community that we are both part of, and that is what she is here to talk about today. So with no further ado and a great pleasure, I hand you all over to her. Take it away, Johanna.
Thank you very much, Josefin, and thank you everyone for showing up today. A special shout out to the Portal Convention, where there are many people who probably know far more collectively about LARP than I do. That's amazing to have you all joining in. And I've reviewed the chat a little bit, and I can see that some of you know very little about LARP, and some of you know quite a lot, in fact, about LARP. And I think that for the latter group, you will not be surprised by anything I say, but I hope that when I talk about what LARP is, and in particular about what Nordic LARP is, that I will help frame that as a sort of setup to then talk about transformation. And I will talk a great deal about what LARP is and what specifically about what Nordic LARP is. So that's what we're going to be doing for a big chunk of this first hour. And then I think that will provoke questions about transformation in play that I'm interested in hearing, in responding to, and that hearing your thoughts on. So I have a few videos relatively early on in this presentation, and those don't work apparently as background slides. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first traditionally screen share, and then I'm going to try and make them a background. We'll see if that works. There's going to be some logistics, and that's just unfortunately the way it is in this new world in which we live. So we'll start by seeing the first step, which is, can I show my presentation? I can, I guess. Do you see my slides? Yes.
Yes,
great.
It's as a standard presentation. As
a standard presentation, yes. And I'm a little head in the screen, and that's just the way it is. Okay, great. Yes. So most of what I'm going to be talking about today is about in some ways what it means to be someone, to pretend to be someone you're not, and can that even mean something, and isn't that necessary for becoming something you feel that you're not. So very briefly, we just heard a bio, so I don't need to run through any of those things, but I do have like like a day job in working with the screen industries in different ways, and a little bit still with radio and so on, which was sort of my first career. But my real heart is in the stuff we're going to talk about today. And I am a co-founder of a company that, among other things, makes LARPs, and I'll talk a little bit about tiny bit about our work today, just as an example. I also founded something called the Nordic Larp Talks, and I will say just now that if you need to write down one thing, it's, oh, I really want to learn more about Nordic Larp, you can go on YouTube and just type in Nordic Larp Talks, and you will find a ton of incredibly interesting and random and deep and funny and wonderful inspiration right there. And I also have this sort of multi-Nordic background. I'm from Finland. I was educated in the UK. And I've lived in Denmark. I now live in Sweden, and I have this sort of very Nordic outlook. And my LARP background is in a very international but Nordic focused context. So all of these things are true for me, like in reality. But in the last few years, I have also been a professional trophy girlfriend, joining my billionaire boyfriend on a visit to Westworld. I had a brief career as a military therapist where my job was to help Space Marines go out on yet another suicide mission fighting the alien invaders in a near future apocalypse. I felt very bad about that because we all understood that that was not a great job for them, but we needed them to do it and somebody needed to manipulate them into it. So that was my job. And in the also near past, pre-pandemic, of course, I've also been a murderous noblewoman at a decadent fake court. I've been tortured in a basement, and I have been a poetry teacher at an exclusive liberal arts college in a castle. And I will tell you right now that that's the one job, like that's the world I would have stayed in, just teach poetry until the end of my days. So these are jobs or social roles, but of course a job is also a social role. So these are roles that I have stepped into for a few days, sometimes just for a few hours, and they weren't real or true in any practical sense, but of course they have affected me, and arguably they have transformed me. And what I'm going to talk about today is to start to approach thinking some ways for me about thinking about this transformation. I'm really early on, like when it comes to this transformation work, I'm early in the process. So for me, I'm looking as much forward to the second half of this bit as the first. So the medium in focus here today is Nordic Larp, and I would now, if we see if we can make this work, but I would like to start by showing you a video. And the speaker is the artistic director of my company, but I have also contributed significantly to what he's saying. So I fully agree with that. And now then the second test happens. Can we hear what he's saying? And can we play the video?
The human brain is very bad at
Yes.
distinguishing between reality and fiction. It does not mean that we don't understand what is reality and fiction, but in the moment when you're experiencing it, the brain has all the same reactions as if it was real. Studies have shown that if you change your physicality, or you put on a costume, or you're given an alibi to behave differently, you change your behavior automatically as a human being. So for example, if you put on a lab coat, you become more decisive and you will become more authoritative in your language and in your body posture. And that happens unconsciously. It's the same thing in LARP. My name is Bjarke Pedersen. I've been LARPing for more than 20 years and designing for equally as long. LARP stands for live action roleplay, and Nordic LARP is a specific subset where we focus on collaborative storytelling. There's many reasons why people engage in LARP, and for some, of course, it's escapism, but I think the main reason is to be able to step into somebody else's shoes for a while. You get a chance to see how other people function. And when you engage with characters that are profoundly different from you, you will learn that that character is also part of you, and that maybe you can enhance the possibilities you have in your own life of engaging with other people. I think there's a movement toward being more active in stories, and one of the big reasons, of course, that we spend so much time passively consuming stuff on screens. But people want to engage with stories, they want to contribute, and they want to be able to step into these worlds together and share moments with other fans. So in traditional storytelling, you often follow one or several characters. Here, the only character you can engage with directly is your own. So you don't have one main character, you have 100 main characters. All participants need to feel like the hero of their own journey. You have to build trust amongst the participants to be able to play together and to be vulnerable together and tell stories that are serious and fun and dangerous. Because without feeling safe, you can't be brave. And only by being brave, you can allow yourself to play around and be something that you are not. The way I see a LARP is like a big interaction machine. So I create all the cogs in the wheels, and the cogs are the characters, it's the world, it's the morality of the world. But as the players and their input are put into this interaction machine, there will be an output. And that output is each individual has their own story told by themselves, and it is a unique story. So whatever happens is the right thing as long as they adhere to the rules of the world. Then you have to trust your participants to explore the theme that you have set within the given framework, and they will tell way more beautiful stories than you could ever imagine yourself.
Yes. So that was produced for the Future of Storytelling Summit, and I wanted to show this, and I'm also going to show some, and just talk a little bit more about like the also commercial environment, because I think it's important to understand that while Nordic Larp, as I shall explain in a moment, is largely created and consumed in non-profit environments, there are also plenty of professionals like Johanna and myself and many, many others who do work and consult with these tools, or even with the specific medium in many sectors internationally. And the skill sets and the design principles involved in making Nordic Larp are obviously very useful in the context of any kind of physical participation or interactive storytelling. And there is a plethora of knowledge available, including that book. I'll give you the name again at the end, to learn more about how that's actually done. And most of this is available for free online. And I mean, for better and for worse, there was a journey also for me personally, which starts with myself as a teenager gluing on some latex elf ears. I was just told today, in fact, I got a message reminding me that we are about 2 weeks out from the 25th anniversary of the first LARP I designed and co-designed and ran. Makes me feel a little bit old, because I'll tell you, it feels like yesterday. But that, you know, and that conversation with my parents, were like, what the hell is going on here? But my mom, who was younger than I am now, was very supportive, I should say, and did play the elder in my village, because she was the only person at whatever 36 or something who we felt could plausibly portray a 98-year-old. Yes, so then we move from that beginning in my life to like working with contemporary artists with LARPs in gallery context, and producing, of course, LARPs for LARP audiences in the context of, in like both nonprofit and in the context of my company, doing LARP-based education, LARP-based brand activations, and indeed, for instance, being one of the many people in my community that Disney Imagineering has spoken to on their journey towards what they call long-form role play. And I'm going to mention this connection a couple of times, because I think that it might be surprising to you to know about this connection between this Nordic sort of or now you're international, but Nordic it started in the Nordics, this underground movement, and this most profitable company in the world. It may in particular surprise you if you are in the US, where the local traditions of LARP are still relatively marginal culturally. And why that is a whole other talk. But I do know that Disney, for instance, on stage at a summit that I was at in San Francisco recently, like 2 years back, they have pretty much said almost explicitly publicly that they do avoid the term LARP, in part because of some remaining cultural stigma in the US. And that, to be clear, is not the status that LARP has in the Nordics. And that is a long story too, but for the purposes of this talk, I'll just say that live role-playing or LARPing was invented independently pretty much everywhere in the world where tabletop role-playing gained a foothold after Dungeons and Dragons was introduced in the 70s. And in the Nordics, a number of, I know this is a white thing, I don't know why. In the Nordic, a number of cultural and societal resources coincidentally intersected around LARPing in the mid-90s. And this involved actually a number of aspects that happened. For instance, in the Nordics, we have a universal right to use even private land recreationally. So everybody had access to places to LARP. There was high internet penetration very early, allowing people to network across physical distances and also across national borders. There was the fact that university education is free And the states, in fact, pay you to study, and not much. But back then, especially, it was possible to have free time for creative pursuits because you didn't need a job if you were a student necessarily. And also we have free healthcare. And another factor was that youth cultural organizations here receive public funding. And this funding can be accessed even by organizations run by young people themselves. So when LARP became a mainstream hobby in the 1990s, and when I say mainstream, I mean, not everybody did it, of course, but folks generally knew about it, and the word itself has been well known in the Nordic languages for decades, in the way that it's kind of becoming a term, like a metaphorical term for pretend play in English just now. So that's been going on for decades in the Nordics. Yes, what now I know what I'm supposed to be seeing, which is, boom, some actual play footage. Can we make that work? We can perhaps not make that work. Yeah, I'm sorry, but there would have been some footage from a fantasy LARP, which alas I cannot show you right now. So I'll just continue talking. Yes, so the term Nordic LARP is often reserved for works that participate in an international discourse around this art form, this type of sort of avant-garde LARP, and that's what's typically referred to as Nordic LARP. There's plenty more LARP than that in the Nordics. People are still LARPing the kind of quote-unquote mainstream LARPs that I was playing also in the 90s, even though they are significantly better now. Actually, they look fantastic, which is why I would have loved to show you some things. They are also much more advanced as experiences. But I will say also that the distinction between like mainstream Nordic LARPs in the Nordic and Nordic LARP as a sort of specific art form isn't super meaningful if you're anywhere further away than, let's say, Northern Europe, probably. Because in fact, most, if not all, LARPs in the Nordics are more similar to each other than they are to LARP traditions, for instance, in the US. And the core qualities that tend to be different are these. The most important is equality of outcome. And what that means is that every participant in a LARP of this type, it has the right inherently to just as awesome an experience as everybody else. You can't pay more to have like a cooler story, and it's not, you know, whether you're at your first LARP or at your 100th, you're allowed, you have the right, in fact, to experience something just as powerful as everybody else. No more or no less. And then an obvious consequence of this then, if everybody is supposed to have this awesome experience, is that the awesomeness of your experience cannot rely on you winning something or on your character achieving all of its goals. Because for a story to be dynamic, characters need to have different goals, many goals ideally. And then of course, per definition, that means that not everyone can win. If there's a love triangle, typically at least one person ends up sad. If there's a duel, probably someone ends up dead. So the enjoyment of this work and the meaning of this work has to come from the journey to the end, from the character trying to reach its goals, while you as a player are trying to generate the most interesting story outcomes while still acting within the agreed upon story parameters. So for instance, maybe your assigned character is very rash. So this allows you, the player, to let your character make bad spontaneous decisions, which might be completely counterproductive to the goal of them winning, so to speak, to them achieving their goals. But it allows you the pleasure of inhabiting someone who's less rational, perhaps, or at least more spontaneous than yourself. And it lets you generate interesting situations, not just for yourself, for the other players as well. Because, of course, the consequence of all this is that everybody needs to tell these stories together. And Nordic LARPs are by many definitions of game, not actually games, although there is certainly playing in many senses of play and playfulness. There is playing, but they're not necessarily games, right? For starters, there are no victory conditions, as you know, for the reason I just explained. It would be very difficult to tell how somebody would win a story. And while there might be abstracted representation of any skills or conflicts or circumstances that it isn't possible to physically embody, these are rarely represented through mathematical statistical systems because it's not needed, because the goal is not to resolve a competition in the fairest possible manner, which would be important if the goal is to win, right? But to collectively negotiate the most satisfying outcome. Now, in some LARPs, the most satisfying solution could involve introducing elements of chance or statistical simulation. And then, of course, you would use those kinds of rule systems. But it's not, but some kind of specific sort of abstracted complex rule system is never taken for granted in Nordic Larp. And I think you will find in many other LARP traditions that they are. I would say, in fact, that nothing is taken for granted in Nordic Larp. A core fundament of Nordic Larp design as a practice is that the goal is not to develop the perfect universal rule system or the perfect setting for telling any kind of story in. For historical reasons, this type of Nordic Larp tend to be one-shots, and they are played as single events. They can be played many times, which means that they need to have good replayability if that's the case. But the idea is typically not to make a ton of sequels. And this leads, of course, to development where every LARP is a standalone independent artwork, and it needs to be designed optimally to achieve its specific goals. The rules, the duration, how characters are created, how backstory is determined, the structure, the dramaturgy, the costumes, what kinds of activities and interactions the participants will do, how much they will prepare or how little they need to prepare. All of these decisions are designed by the primarily, I would say, determined primarily by that project's specific aesthetic goals. And secondarily, first by its aesthetic goals, secondarily by its resources, because then, of course, there are some limitations usually in the real world. Perhaps you have a budget, perhaps you want to use a specific location, perhaps your team has more or less time available, and so on. But what is typically not taken into account is how other LARPs in the past have worked. That is, this is not a tradition-based discipline, except in the sense that tested approaches offer more colors to paint with. And I've written mixing desk on this slide, and this is now your second Googling tips. The best known metaphor for LARP design is a mixing desk, and there's a number of faders, actually theoretically an infinite amount of choices that you can make. And again, if you just Google mixing desk of LARP, it will take you to a lot of fun and thought-provoking resources about how to approach this. In subject matter, in range, in aesthetic agendas, Nordic Larp is closely related to the arts, and therefore it is also aligned with what today would be called serious games. The players are typically adults and no topics are off limits. And again, if you search history of LARP on YouTube, you will find a lecture by Erik Fatland that goes all the way back to the 1910s. But for now, let's just say that Nordic Larp is a subset of a wider medium of LARP and freeform, which in turn are different kinds of role-playing games that are specifically played in the first person with physical representation of the action. So it's very difficult to draw a specific definition or like an edge around it, but largely the role-playing happens while moving around in some way in a space or physically embodying the character. And depending on your background, I've also found it helpful to just mention that Nordic style LARPs typically have no performers or very few. That is to say, most or all characters, including antagonists, are portrayed by actual participants. And this means that even bad guys have to have well-rounded characters, and personalities and a chance at success. That's this collective storytelling goals in action again. They also tend to offer full agency or an illusion of agency. So the players feel like they are able to do and create anything, of course, within the agreed upon frames of rule and fiction. And then what Nordic Larp specifically has, which is different from many, if not most other LARP traditions, is almost 25 years, almost 30 years at this point of systematic, documented, iterative testing of narrative design practices. And that's what's kind of allowed us to break away from iterating only within our own local traditional type of LARP. And once again, we have a film that's disappeared. So I'm just gonna skip this entirely. What I will say is that what tends to pop in Nordic LARP documentation, and if you've heard or seen any videos from Nordic LARP, for instance, it tends to be stuff that looks great in pictures. And one aesthetic that is very beloved is the 360-degree illusion, where the work will go to very great lengths to create a fully immersive environment. So I was going to show you some pictures from a LARP called Monitor Celestra, which was some Battlestar Galactica fan fiction, which was notable for being produced in a museum battleship, which was rebuilt to simulate a fully functioning spaceship for several days. And this was, as far as I know it, the first time I met the Disney Imagineers at a LARP. This was here. Let's see if we can make that work. Here's, I'll just show you just some visuals from a LARP. And this is very well known. You may have come across this video. It's called the College of Wizardry. It was a Harry Potter homage produced by a Danish-Polish team in Poland. Now, it became originally groundbreaking as what is now known as Destination LARP, which is people will travel internationally to, in this case, to finally experience that magic school that they had longed for since childhood. A lot of these players are, some of these players are my age, but a lot are in the sort of Harry Potter generation. These days, of course, College of Wizardry is an independent IP, and I must say, for the record, that these LARPs have a fraught and complicated history, and the company that that ran them originally went bankrupt, which is perhaps just as well. But these LARPs are supposed to return actually this fall, after the pandemic, at least, with a new organization behind it. Now, as you can see in these images, this is clearly entertainment. But consider for a moment the power of being transported into a world where magic works and you can wield it, where you belong, where you have friends and meaningful things to do. And in this particular fiction, over time, also a world where gender identity is as fluid as you like and relationships are not heteronormative. Maybe you as a participant are a massive fantasy nerd, maybe you're a queer kid as well. A lot of the players here did not have positive and empowering experiences of school. And just being able to change that, seeing yourself in another position has power. And again, to be clear, some people did have bad experiences at College of Wizardry, but those tended to be about other things than the LARP. When I say that LARP stories can thematically be about anything, I mean it. And of course, diverse designers will tell a diversity of stories. So just to mention two completely different examples, Just a Little Lovin' is a canonical LARP work at this point. There's a new book out if you want to read more about that. It is a historical exploration of love, sexuality, and loss in the gay community as the AIDS crisis hits it in the early 1980s. And that's a 4-day experience. It's very powerful for anyone, but of course for queer players who are playing the personal community history, it's very strong indeed, and the designers also have that background. And then on the right, we see an image from The Perfect Human, which is a conceptual 8-hour LARP experience where you physically reenact office life in stock photos. So you work at an office where everybody is always cheerful and constructive and lighting is great and everything always goes well. You're probably like laughing at salad at lunch. So these examples that I've shown you are quite visual, and it is great to step into a fictional world that is fully present. And I can tell you that sure makes virtual reality feel pretty weak. That said, Nordic Larp pretty much figured out how to do these full illusion environments more than 15 years ago. And it turned out, we learned that good-looking LARP is not automatically powerful because role-playing actually happens inside of the person, not in the environment. Although that, of course, can help your imagination. And now, I'm half an hour in. I think I've shown all my videos, or the ones that I was allowed to by Zoom. And I will now change to the other screen sharing view, if that is possible. So now is a good time to stretch. I will stop share. I will attempt to share screen again. And now we can do the part where my head floats as though I am a Cheshire puss. It turns out Alex here. It was great. Let's jump forward to 70. Yes. All right. Yes. So it turned out that creating a perfect illusion didn't actually solve all our interesting storytelling problems. So there was a counter movement within the Nordic Larp community in the last 10-15 years, stripping down the aesthetics to be able to hone the craft of specifically designing that interaction machine, the dynamics of a situation and the social roles that generate thematically coherent story outcomes for the participants as they are moving freely through this fiction. So in the last 10 years or so, many of our strongest designers have backed away from showy venues and expensive production in favor of what is called black box LARP, which is produced in a theatrical black box. So you remove the sets, the costumes, sometimes even all spoken dialogue, to focus on the body and to focus on the body and on character interactions. I'm receiving a suggestion from the chat. Should I act upon that, or does this do you guys what you want?
I think this is absolutely fine. For me, it looks the same as before.
Okay, great. That's great. Thanks, guys. Yes. So it turns out that for those of you now who are looking at how to use LARP in classrooms, I'm sure it's very helpful to learn that actually you might have a very powerful experience without a castle, because fitting a castle into, for instance, an American school can be very challenging. I will also say in the 90s, we tried to solve this by like building the castles out of cardboards in the gym of the school and things like that. That usually didn't produce the effects that we were looking for, but like we have tested also that. So, but what happens when you remove all of the visual stuff, you know, then you focus on the characters and the body. And actually, what you also suddenly get access to all the tools of theatrical storytelling. So like in the theater, visual abstraction actually, for instance, liberates you from linear time and other realism limitations, right? Black box LARPs are often shorter in format, typically only 4 hours, including onboarding and reflection. And this length is as very often happens, it's a sort of production reality coincidence. Black box LARPs are typically played at Black box LARP festivals, and 4 hours is a convenient slot time to be able to maximize the number of productions during one weekend. I often recommend to designers of VR or immersive theater, and in fact, probably any kind of educational interaction experience as well, that to attempt this kind of black box type situation as a very economical testing method. Because when you take out all of the flavor and the special effects and visual surfaces and stop worrying about rendering for a while, what remains is character functions, interaction rules, and the relationships between the characters, and of course also with the use of any functional objects that are required to tell the story. If you can make your experience work in a black box, this is like the interactive experience of equivalent of a cardboard prototype. You have to make it work in a black box first, and then can you decide whether it's strong enough to potentially develop in VR or physically build. And yes, of course, if you are working iteratively in VR, you can do the same thing inside your fiction, of course, and that's just not as convenient, for instance, for interactive theater. So what is Nordic LARP? Okay, it's not about how it looks, even though sometimes if you read about this on the American internet, they will tell you that it's something that requires a castle. No, destination LARP, very different. Basically, it's not about how it looks, it's about how it's made. So here is my very, very simplified diagram. On the left side of my screen, it says iterating on a tradition. And on the right side, it says bespoke design. And on the top, it says gamist, by which I mean mechanical systems. And those are often also like statistical and mathematical in different ways. And on the bottom, it says collaborative. So that would be social systems. And then, oh, you are not seeing the diagram. I apologize. That's because now I'm doing this on 2 screens. Okay, and now I'm a floating head, but that's okay. Here is the diagram. Thank you so much for keeping me honest with my slides. Yes. So what we see, and again, like this is obviously a massive simplification, right? But we would then say that on the left kind of side of this diagram, we have big campaign systems for sandbox games in particular, where you make a system to tell any story. Focus is on motivating player conflict and on simulating outcomes in a more or less competitive situation. And towards the right, you will be designing only for what you need for the theme and experience of what you're actually going for. Onboarding becomes very different because the participants have to learn the rules and the culture and the principles of the work for every work sort of separately. But on the other hand, that material will be significantly shorter because it's only for that event. So it's arguably actually easier. And of course, all of these squares constantly influence each other. And in addition, there is also input from different kinds of nearby practices into the different squares, which then again all talk to each other. And again, if I make this super simplified, let's not pick fights about this, but sort of kind of largely speaking, you could then say that in collaborative style role-playing, the focus will need to be on trust and on the collective making of story. And on the sort of more mechanical competitive side, that you will need to focus in your design on fairness, on like how to make the outcomes just in the simulations. And very often they are also designed, for instance, with story modules or different ways of like unfolding story. In the middle, it can go in either direction. Yes. Here was a video again. I can't show the video. That's okay. Yes, so what we could have added to the previous diagram is a kind of commercial axis, which thinks about, do you view yourself as a consumer or a co-creator? The thing is, buying a ticket to a Nordic Larp is not actually to buy access to an experience. You're not a consumer in that situation. You get a chance, you get access to the chance to create something awesome in a collective. And sometimes you will pay literally hundreds of euros for that privilege, but it's still a privilege. The strength of your experience can't be guaranteed because it will be delivered by the participant group, not just as much as by the design. But to be clear, like my company is a business and we do make LARPs, and I want to say that it's not profitable. But for us in our other consulting, we consider our LARP work to be our R&D. And we do occasionally make brand collaborations. For instance, with Vampire the Masquerade, we made some Nordic style events that we produced for a convention in Berlin. And later, which is what I really wanted to tell about, we made an experimental production set in the same universe. And I'd just like to tell you a little bit about that to set up what I want to talk about later. So this is called Parliament of Shadows. It was designed by Maria Pettersson, Johanna Pettersson, and Bjarke Pedersen. And it was about how the vampire cabals in this world of darkness fiction, how they actually interact with real world politics, which in the fiction they do. How does that work, we asked. And it was played on location in the real European Parliament and also on other locations around Brussels. So these are actual play photos by Tuomas Puikkonen. The pictured here, you will see players, including two actual members of the European Parliament who were there as making brief appearances, but they were as in for some hours, and they were playing lightly fictionalized and in one case evil versions of themselves. And yes, I should say that Tuomas Puikkonen, who has taken these pictures, is in my view the best documentary photographer of LARPs in the world. So now if you think about like a LARP set in a supernatural world, you would think that the content would mostly be stuff like this. And yes, there was a tiny smattering of it in this place. And some of the locations were pretty cool, the kind of places where lobbyists would normally be. But to be clear, the target audience for this LARP was vampire nerds who are also policy wonks. And that latter part was really important because all of the lobbyist meetings and legislative issues were about real world policy topics with relevance to vampires, such as visa requirements between the EU and the US, and also blood bank legislation. And prep memos were prepared by actual parliament staffers, and everything that happened in the meetings was by any normal standards really boring. But in this style of LARP, you don't need stories about armed conflict to create high-stakes situations. In fact, quite often physical discomfort or painful emotion, and yes, even boredom, are an intentional part of a LARP experience because it gives depth and meaning that create narrative stakes. You wouldn't watch a movie where only good things happen to the protagonists. Indeed, quite often we engage with stories that are tragedies. But on the other hand, we do often engage with fictions, especially novels, where very little of interest or nothing of interest happens externally to the main character. Mrs. Dalloway moves through her quotidian tasks, and it's riveting because we have access to her emotions and to the minute social nuances around her. If you look at these faces in this image, clearly there is a lot going on. And I feel, I mean, of course I know, but like I feel that I can tell that these are not actors. They're not performing. They are in some sense living this story. And a player was gracious enough to show us some elevated heart rate notifications from this day of boring meetings. And we can see here that it goes up, in fact, towards the, well, it's in the 120 to 142 or 124 to 155 beats per minute range. And the thing is, it's really exciting to live and act and be treated as though your fictional character is real, your persona here is real. Because in full agency storytelling, what you do matters. Your choices shape outcomes for your characters and all the others. And the reason that this fiction works in the social is the social agreement to stay within the limits of the world and as designed and the rules of the event. And people do, because that's how you get access to this co-creation process. If you break that, you will break it for yourself as much as for everybody else. So these seemingly simple tricks of social contracts allow the participants to tell magnificent stories together. But as with any participatory work, you experience it as a first-person audience. The audience position is, that's what we call it in LARP, the audience position is inside the body of each participant. Yes. So the character is the interface to play, to the story world. And through the character's subjective agency and also through your agency as a player, which is of course greater, the character becomes the interface to the narrative. And I talk about these agencies as different because it's very important that you as a participant have control of what happens, especially if you're playing with sensitive content or with themes that can be painful, or with your physical body and so on. But the character's agency is determined by their social roles, like when you are a child or a student or a professor or a whatever it is, general, all of these roles will come with different spheres of and ranges of action. So then that's one of the hearts in any kind of social fiction is the difference of the agencies, and a big part of the experience in a LARP, I would argue, is trying to navigate the world from the position of another person's range of movement, so to speak, the agency of their social roles. And arguably, this is actually even more important than experiencing another character's psychology. I think we made a historical error 30-40 years ago when we started to call it role play, or to not make a distinction between role play and character play, because one character or one person such as myself can have multiple social roles, which we switch between in real life very fluidly, and of course fictional people do the same thing. They also have a character, that is to say the character has a fictional psychology and his biography and personal goals that in some LARPs are super meaningful and in some LARPs are not. Some people feel like they need to be good actors to be able to LARP. You don't, because the character play ultimately is secondary. You just, as long as you act within the range of like that person's social movement, then you're playing well from the perspective of everybody else. And that will suggest you whether or not you in your mind are immersed into the psychology of the character. That's kind of irrelevant. You can do it. It's pleasurable. Many people prefer it. Some people prefer not to do that at all as they play. But from the outside, it looks the same. The real experience is about navigating the world in the roles of other people. And for this social reality to be real, every participant must be treated as their fictional roles. And every player importantly, must be able to experience their character's journey as narratively meaningful. Remember at the beginning, I said equality of outcome. So maybe my character has very little power in this world, but the LARP needs to be designed in such a way that from the perspective of that person's agency, they can go on a wonderful journey. There are films that are told from the perspective of the butler or the maid, and there are films that are where the same story is told from the perspective of the upstairs people, and both of those stories can be just as powerful, even though they don't have access to the full information. In fact, often because they don't have access to the full information of what's happening when they themselves are, so to speak, off stage. So they are always in focus, and every character needs to be able to be the main character of their own LARP. So if the character is the interface to the LARP, I arguably would say that the body is the interface to the character. And this is happening on different levels. One is the external representation. My body represents the body of the character. This is different from many other role-playing traditions where the character can look like anything, which is differently from the player's body and age and species and mobility and all of those things. In Nordic Larp, very often the character, the looks of the character and the look of the participant are very similar, although because of the magic of role-playing, of course, you can be a different age or much less beautiful or much more beautiful, and there are many things that we can do with design as well to support these fictions. And there are real limitations as well. That's a topic for another time, but there are also great limitations having to do with the players inevitably bringing in their own real-world prejudices into in-game situations as well. And maybe it is very difficult, for instance, to accept a 60-year-old player as a 20-year-old character, for instance, and so on. But that's one level of thinking about the relationship with the body and the character. I would say it's the least interesting. Then the next level is, from the participant's perspective, you're literally walking in someone else's shoes. Actually, in a Nordic type LARP with a high ambitious type of costuming, you probably are walking in a kind of shoes that you would not have otherwise worn. And that in itself, like any actor will tell you, once you get the character's shoes on, then you start to understand who they are. You will understand how they walk, how they work, how they move through the world. And sometimes often this includes things like physical experiences. In my life, I don't need to carry heavy things around very often, but in LARPs, for some reason, that seems to happen very often to me. And there are many other kinds of physical activities and physical experiences that I can enjoy being outdoors or whatever it is that may not be as present in my real life. And of course, that is also affecting me through the interface of the body. But most importantly, the body is the interface to the character because we share the same brain chemistry and we share the same emotional machinery. And even when we are acting in that social fiction and experiencing nuanced social interactions, all of the fears and the pleasures and the joys and the nerves around that are, of course, generated in the body. Like these emotions are physically real, even though we, in our culture, conceptualize them as somehow mental states that only exist abstractly. The scientific fact is that they are generated in our body, which then has this overlap with the character body. And when you are immersed into character and when you are present in the social reality of the fictional situation, you will have realistic reactions from the character's perspective, inevitably, and that then allows you to go deeper or to be more realistically closer to the character in your mind. And this also has some astonishing effects. We have, I mean, you'll hear a lot of anecdotes, but here is one that I happen to trust very deeply, because the participant who told me this story or gave a talk about this actually is a neuroscientist professionally, and he said that he suffers in real life from a very difficult phobia of the dark. And to his great astonishment, he was in a situation, he was scouting locations for a LARP at his city in northern Sweden, and he was in this environment and he found himself alone as himself looking at this venue, and he freaked himself out. And then later, when, you know, months later, he came back to play this LARP in this venue that he had scouted, and he found himself in the same place again, but now in character and in a similar situation. And he was so surprised because he realized he was not having any of those physical reactions that he had learned to always expect in these situations, and that were now like the memory of a feeling that was triggered because he had been in that environment before, but he realized his phobia was overruled by his pretend play of being somebody who is not afraid of the dark. So I find very interesting. Okay. Now, let's be realistic about how much of this is LARP stuff. I think a lot of people who go to LARPs will tell you that even very surprising LARPs that are not designed to be particularly transformative, that perhaps have a very just light escapist agenda, they will come and tell you that this has changed their life. And then a question is, what do we mean when we talk about changing, like a life being changed, or what is a life-changing experience? And I think part of the problem here is that we have such limited language just in our culture to talk about these things in general. I think that any social role, new role in any new social environment can be powerfully transformative, for better or for worse. I think everybody who's gone to moved to a new school and felt that they have a chance to like reinvent themselves, or somebody who's gone backpacking, you go and you take a gap year and you do something else, or you go on a retreat, or you switch jobs, you end up in a new work environment where your role is different and your worth perhaps is different, you're seen in a different way. And these can be incredibly powerful and transformative experiences. And LARPs very often depict situations where people are performing meaningful tasks together. So you are very often assigned a community and a meaningful project. So of course that's going to feel great. I would argue also that experiencing a social environment with other norms and practices can, again, in itself allow you new roles and perspectives. Once, of course, moving to another country will teach you a lot about what you thought was just like being a human, which turns out being a person who lives in your country, or being a person of your social background or your area of the country, or whatever it is. Just like placing yourself differently will teach you, oh, I thought this was about humaning, but that was, I am actually a Finn, or whatever it is. And this can also be, I think if you go to Burning Man, for instance, in the US, which is this big sort of temporary autonomous zone festival situation in the desert, one of the things there is that they don't have, there's no money economy, people only gift. And you are also which in the US, of course, is very rare, there's no advertising. So you will spend a week or 4 days sometimes in an environment where you're not exposed to commercial messaging at all. And just that is to many people a life-changing experience, because it's something that you can't imagine, like leaving the paradigms of the world in which you live, like leaving an economy based on transactions is mind-blowing until you experience it. And again, that's not something that's necessarily unique to LARP, but of course, LARPs are very often designed specifically as sort of simulations of very different worlds and norm systems. So that also is a machine that allows you to take a vacation from reality, and that will be experienced by many people in ways that they will call life-changing, which perhaps are, but perhaps they are also like understanding changing. It's not so much they who have changed, but their view of the world has changed. And then I think that this type of narrative where the journey of each character, like when you write LARPs of this kind, just in the interest of like time and also to allow for that full agency, you can't dictate what the participants are actually going to do. And that means that to allow them to go on a journey, the player will either allow them some kind of transformation, they will change in the circumstances, or they will not change in the circumstances. And either of those becomes an interesting story in itself. And that means that to play this type of LARP, you're automatically involved in transformation stuff. Yes. I will try to speak a little bit slower. It's very difficult for me, as you may have heard at this, as you may have understood at this point. Okay, so these are some of the ways in which we engage with transformation in Nordic Larp, just because of the nature of the medium or because of the nature of the environment. Yes. So now, yes, let's see how much I have left. We're doing good. Well, I'm going to go a little bit over, but not a lot. Okay, so in LARP, traditionally, we used to say something along these lines. When emotions travel between character and player, accidentally or on purpose, LARPers call this bleed, both for positive and negative experiences. And to be clear, bleed is not harmful, but its emotional impact is typically unpredictable. And if you want to learn more about bleed, I will refer you to the amazing work by Sarah that you can find probably links to after. And it's good to know that players can have very strong reactions to LARPs, but they tend to react not necessarily to strong themes, which is always the concern, but really it's just random situations and events that echo our own life, sometimes not even in particularly dramatic ways that will trigger, now in a positive sense, the interactions with our own life. And I will also say that many kind of LARPs are designed to do this on purpose. Many kind of LARPs are designed to place the player very close to their character and to use their own life and their own experiences to bring into the character journey and to give it richness and depth and to explore the character through the emotional resonance of their real world experiences. And this can be incredibly powerful. And as I said, the medium does it on its own. That's why some people are very surprised at their reactions to sort of light entertainment LARPs, but it's also possible to do that intentionally. But I would say that it's about as difficult to warn the participants in advance, because until you've played this type of role-playing games, and this can happen in many kinds of role-playing games, I think it's difficult to understand how real it might feel. And even while you're in it and you know it's not real, there's no doubt in your mind that you're in a fictional situation. Why are the emotions so true and so deep? And of course that is because the body and of you and the body of the character are the same. So the emotions, the body, as Bjarke said in that video at the beginning, the brain isn't great at understanding concepts like fiction. Those are cultural constructs, right? But we also have a lot of experience in contextualizing fictional experiences to make them meaningful input in our life. Okay, can LARPs transform players? Yes, and so clearly many LARPs allow participants, intentionally or unintentionally, and not all at the same time, but in a sort of random way, many participants in LARPs will perceive that they have had either a very intense experience, which they may call life-changing because they have access to an art form and a medium that they weren't aware of. Similarly, you will hear a lot of musicians perhaps talk about how going to the opera for the first time was life-changing for them. That is definitely a thing. It's also possible that there is something just in being in different social roles, experiencing yourself as an actor and experiencing competence at being a person in another social dynamic than the one you're normally in, that can in itself be incredibly inspiring and transformative. And then there is also the possibility to use LARPs intentionally for transformative purposes, that is to take in some element of your experience into this sort of safe place where you can go stand close to the thing that scares you and work on some of your stuff in that way. I think that most people will do this automatically. I think we do that with all our culture. That's how we engage with works of fiction. But at the same time, of course, you need to do it within the social agreement of the overall experience, because the other participants are maybe not there necessarily for your therapeutic purposes, and that needs to be taken into account for reasons of consent and also respect. Then we have educational transformation. And I will just say that edu-larp, as it's called, edu-larp, is something you can Google and something you can learn about a lot. And yes, there's definitely the thing about tricking folks to learn through engagement, but the learning kind of happens not so much during the engagement necessarily, but in reflection. And I feel silly talking about this when Josefin Westborg is sitting right there, but like there's a lot of really good knowledge around in the uses of LARP to teach people things, specific things, like things of a curriculum, through making them engaging. And here, of course, this is also one of the reasons that why I wanted to mention Parliament of Shadows, which wasn't designed to be an edu-LARP, but in every other sense than its intention was an incredibly educational LARP about how the political processes in Brussels operate. And then there's political transformation. And this one I find is very interesting. And I will say first that sometimes political transformation and personal transformation are inseparable from each other. We ran one of our vampire events is a sort of nightclub LARP, and the participants at this event do very nightclubby things, and to allow them to do that safely, we designed a lot of consent mechanics into this. In fact, Sarah was also involved in designing them for our American run of this. And when we ran this vampire dance club bloodbath LARP in New Orleans, afterwards, one of our players, a female player, told us she was feeling a little bit weird about the whole thing, and she couldn't figure out why. And she came back later and said, I think the reason why I'm feeling weird is that during this experience, during those 4 or 6 hours, whatever it was, she said, it was the first time in my life that I had felt fully in control of who touches my body. And this is the kind of thing, I'm sorry, like I don't know if I want to cry or cheer. Like that is not that LARP's purpose was to create like a cool vampire nightclub experience, but to be able to do that, we needed to design it in a way where consent really worked, because like Bjarke says in the video, if you don't feel safe, you can't be brave. If you want to role play, if you want to put yourself into and try actions that you wouldn't normally, you have to feel like you are in control and you're not going to be judged, and you're safe, socially and physically safe, and that you can make those playful narrative choices. And then to be able to do that, to enable that, we had to put systems in place for consent. But as a side effect, a person who had possibly never questioned in their life their existence in the world as a person who often doesn't feel physically safe in a nightclub environment, at least, suddenly got to experience that. And even though they knew that this was a fictional situation and they were actually safe anyway, that became a transformative experience for them. And that in itself can be an entry to political transformation, right? So people make political LARPs, and I think we have to understand that those in the context of what is now known as impact entertainment. We used to talk about impact documentaries in film for a long time, and that's documentaries that are made like with the explicit goal of people learning about some shit so you can change something in the world, right? And now we're increasingly talking about impact entertainment, that you could argue that a lot of I don't know, I'm thinking about Black Panther now, it's a very expensive example, but big and small examples of making entertainment experiences or properties or books that are also about issues and that do have an explicit agenda, or at least an implicit agenda of changing something in the world. And many LARP makers who make LARPs about educational or political topics are doing it with impact goals, even though we haven't talked about them in that sense. And there, it is a very powerful tool to change the individual's perspective and experience, as I have said. But here is the point where I'm a little bit like, I want to say that maybe this is not a very powerful tool for directed political transformation. And in part that is because the very notion of going on that character journey and participating in all of the functions in a conflict, for instance, taking all the roles in a conflict situation, may mean that some of the participants will maybe not engage at all with the political themes of the thing. They might go on, like, they might be all totally in the characters, like bad breakup from their ex-husband. And that could be an incredibly powerful thing for them, but you're not going to hit them. The bleed kind of goes where it will. And you're not going to affect necessarily their deep political understanding. The edular people will also tell you that the learning happens after, in the reflection phase after the experience. And that means, of course, that if you want to make impact LARPs, you can build some reflection in and help reframe the experiences, whatever they were inside that, towards the political frame. Of course, you want to establish that in the beginning as well, but that's one possible way of doing it. But of course, then the final problem with this is that it scales very poorly. So if you can profoundly impact a significant percentage of your participants, that's still, in a very controlled, beautifully designed LARP experience, that's very difficult to get to hundreds or thousands or millions of people. And that means, on the other hand, that if you want to use that to change the world, you have to find the right people, like people with agency in a process, and convince them to play your LARP, which you can do, but that is not a trivial challenge. So I'll end on this thought. In LARP design, we have often said that the core question, actually this is true for any kind of experience design, would be, what kinds of activities will my participants be doing? And for that, if it's a LARP or some other kind of participatory piece, for that participation to be meaningful, you also have to ask, how are those verbs, the things that the participants are participating with in your piece, how are those verbs connected to the themes of the piece? Those need to be coherent, I feel, for the piece to work powerfully. And then there's that whole thing about being safe to be brave. So you have to ask yourself, what kinds of social and physical frameworks will allow my participants to do the activities that I need them to do so that they can engage with the themes of the piece through actions? And that's where we've usually left it. But I think it's worth thinking about designing for transformation, that you might want to add 2 questions, or 1 question perhaps, and that is, how do I want my participants to change? And very often in art, we kind of don't do that. We say, well, they can experience the work any way they like. That is the freedom of the that is what the artwork leaves me, and then the participant can do with it what they will. And that is true. But at the same time, that is a less unpredictable outcome if you're writing a novel or whatever it is. And in fact, change here, this question is still about what can be things about, like, what do I want them to learn about themselves, or how do I want to change their perspective on the world? And that's meaningful. But if you want to change a system, or if you want to change something in the world, you might actually want to change that question to this, which is, how do I want my participant to change in the world? So you have to ask not just what verbs do I want my peoples to do inside my piece, but also what verbs do I want them to do after the piece. And normally, of course, you would design an artwork so that it is completed at the end of the experience with the reflection phase. But I think maybe here, if you want to affect change in the world, you want to leave it kind of open-ended so that the piece is only completed once the action in the world is performed. You might want to be transparent about this, because it would be pretty manipulative to do it, to not do that. But yes, I'm going to stop here because I've gone over time. I'm sorry. Here is my email address. It's johanna@participation.design. That's my Twitters, but I'm there very rarely. You can also email me on that address if you want to buy a physical copy of the LARP design book. I will hook you up. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. Should I stop here now?
Thank you, Johanna, for this deep dive into Nordic LARP and players' personal transformations, and maybe, or maybe not, political transformation of the world. So we are going to have some time for Q&A. And we have some questions that have come in already, but feel free to ask more questions, and please use the Q&A part for that to help us keep up. So the first question I have for you is from Mirka, who wonders, are there any specific game or character elements, narrative or mechanical wise, that work especially well in generating meaningful and transformative experiences?
Okay, now I will think aloud, and now anything can happen. But I would say like the first place where the mind goes is to think that the deeper you go into your character situation, the more powerful it becomes. That would be the first instinct. And I will warn you a little bit against that first instinct. Because, well, for many reasons, but the short answer is because the learning happens in the reflection, right? Now, we have the benefit, on the other hand, now of having a better, I think, more functional image of what actually happens when we are role-playing. And there's been different metaphors used about this over time. Some people talked about it's like you're swimming in water and sometimes you dive very deep, but you have to come up for air. And sometimes you're sort of in the middle where it's not so much, you don't have to work so hard to dive. And then sometimes you dive. And then, of course, like in any creative pursuit, it's nice to go into a flow state where the process becomes automatic of portraying the character. But really, what we are, because we are also driving this puppet, right, while we are working. There's some nice work now in the last few years by Hilda Levin, for instance, talking about meta reflection, so that there's this process where we are, as we are playing very rapidly, we're running these sort of cycles where we are sort of zooming out on different levels and thinking about, where is this character going? What do I want? Am I participating in things that I want or not? And I think it's possible probably to build in that transformative by being very careful about the frame of what is the work trying to achieve. And the people are on board with that. Sometimes you can even instruct people that, build in breaks or things where you do zoom out of character and think about the character's position in this context of the issue or the transformation, and then allow them to go in deeper again. So that's something that I would think about. So think just as much about what happens sort of out of character or between the deep dives as what happens with is how close or deep the character is to the player.
Thank you. Then we take the next question we have here. How do you usually deal with being in character or out of character or on and off throughout your LARPs? Thinking about Bleed, for example. Do you have debriefings or breaks throughout, or do you usually go all in until the LARP ends? Wonders,
Yes.
Pelle.
Very good question, Pelle. That can be handled in different ways. But the most important is that every participant will handle it themselves. I think if you're at a 5-day LARP, it's impossible to be in character the whole time, even though there are some aspects, like if you can leave your phone outside the area, for instance, and there are things like that you can do, but probably you're still going to get up in the morning and put your contacts in, or when you go to the bathroom, you will probably not be thinking super much about, the character's bowel movements and more about your own. So some of that's automatically built in. But yes, there is some an onboarding process. So people will, I would say, in Europe, always meet out of character before, sometimes at a separate event, but typically on site before you start playing. And then you will do all the preparations that need doing, which might be a great deal or relatively little. But at the very least, you need to know who is playing my people, like who is supposed to be my husband today, and it's good if you can recognize them. But you can also do hours and hours of preparation and reflection before going in, depending on the piece. And then there are different, like either structured breaks. Sometimes you sleep out of character, for instance, or there are act breaks with time jumps, or you will have a space where you can go at any moment to sort of step out of character and just rest a while, because again, like it's so helpful. Also, if your game gets boring, what often happens is you've kind of lost track of the trajectory. You have gotten stuck in the character and lost yourself as a player a little bit. That's when it gets boring. So you step outside and you're the player again. And then you can see, oh yeah, this is where I'm trying to go. And then you can go back in, and then suddenly it will be engaging again. And afterwards, yes, there's some kind of reflection period that may involve de-rolling. Debriefing is a tricky word, I think, especially if you're working with educational experiences or traumatic or like heavy themes or potentially traumatic content, because when participants have strong experiences, they may be in the moment seduced to believe that their experiences of this artwork are somehow comparable to the suffering of some actual humans whose suffering is represented in this fiction. And I think the word debriefing, with its connection to trauma and all of that, puts perhaps unnecessary focus on, I mean, I've used it for years myself, but I've been thinking recently that I feel like the word debriefing in the context of LARP puts unnecessary focus on the sort of quote unquote suffering of the participant, and maybe reflection as an overall term for de-rolling and aftercare and all of the other activities that happen might be more constructive in a way also, because when we are talking about real world suffering, it's also healthy for the player to separate my journey with this story from the pain in the world that it's engaging with in some way.
Thank you. So here we have a question from Verena, who asks, is change, the direction or the outcome, really plannable or designable? Would we even want to plan a specific change? I think that the only thing the design can influence is create the theme, pivotal point around which change may happen, but not what the change is.
Yes, this is a very good point. I think it's a more realistic goal to create a crisis of impact, rather to design for insight, rather than design for a specific change action. So that may be, that's a good distinction. I'm thinking about Just a Little Lovin', which was the LARP about AIDS history, which has had a lot of real world impacts, because players who have played it, regardless of their own personal sexual identity, have often been very strongly affected and have been disillusioned perhaps in their views or of how their respective countries handled this crisis originally. And I will just summarize the history of AIDS care in the world by saying it was a shit show and a massive betrayal of everybody involved. I don't think there was any country that did this well or right. So pretty much wherever the participants are from, they will go back home after this LARP and be like, oh my God, here is a part of the history of my country that hasn't been told. So I worked in radio, and I had a production company at the time. I came back and pitched a 4-part documentary about the history of AIDS in Sweden, and some other, and then we did that. And one of the other journalists who made one of the other documentaries also had also played the LARP. I think some other participants went back and organized the first geeks marching in the Pride Parade in Copenhagen, thing that has grown into a big movement, because of course there are a lot of rainbow geeks and allies. So, and so the actions can be very different. But I think that it's worth, even then, I think it would still be meaningful to be a little bit specific about, because you can also direct this in the after LARP reflection and say, here are some questions for you to take with you when you go home. Because if you're just angry at the world, you play a LARP about the refugee crisis, and then you are about a refugee crisis, and then you're outraged at the state of asylum systems. Sometimes a lot of people will still need and here are some numbers that you can call if you want to join an organization. It's also nice to help people direct that. But of course you can design a process where the participants together identify places where they have agency in the real world to affect something, to do something with their emotions, and you can help create the platform for that.
Thank you. So following up a bit on that, we have from Electra. Hello, Johanna, always a pleasure to hear you talk. I was wondering if you have some more comments on the ethical side of designing for transformation, like the comment you made in passing about the need to have clarity on the aims of the LARP.
Yes. So on one level, artwork, art in general, is inherently transformative, and engaging with fiction or engaging with simulations will, it's kind of built into it that you are at risk of learning something about yourself or telling a story that changes something about how you view the world. So that's kind of built in. I don't think we necessarily need to be super specific about it on that level. But I think that if you have impact goals for your work, I think it is very helpful and ethical to be specific about that. Then participants won't always hear you and really understand that they might be changed, but at least you've told them, and that's very helpful. And that goes actually for a lot of design elements. What I would advise against is a kind of surprise bait and switch. There's a very famous example, but what on earth was it called? There was a LARP, there was a kind of post-apocalyptic city in Denmark. Hello, can somebody, do you remember what it was
Denmark?
called? Yes, System Denmark. Yes, that was it. And you played this sort of ghetto environment, and it did this sort of thing where it was kind of sold as a sort of kind of cool pseudo cyberpunk LARP, or like it's a dystopian gang environment, and it had like elements of cool entertainment. And at the very end, they gathered all the characters into a space and showed them an out of character short documentary about the class society in contemporary Denmark, and which in itself was, I think, a very powerful piece that they had made for this. But a lot of the participants felt incredibly betrayed because they had been seduced by the fiction and by all the messaging of the piece into playing around in a sort of trivializing manner and glorifying manner with some of the substance abuse and the violence and so on. And then if you kind of pull their pants down and say, haha, in the real world, substance abuse and violence are terrible. Like that is not going to generate an effect where they can take their LARP experience and transform that into some constructive use in the real world in regards to, for instance, poverty and substance abuse and marginalization, which was the goal. So that's just a kind of poor design thing. I think they could have run the exact same event and framed it as questioning, like exploring the tensions between entertainment glorifying this environment, for instance, and the real world situation. And that could have been really interesting, but then you kind of have to take the participant with you on the journey so that they can do something with it. But to be clear, like, again, this isn't LARP specific. I think Martin Scorsese is a filmmaker who has very explicitly said that his aesthetic project with his films about the mafia was to make realistic stories about what it's really like in a kind of sociological, anthropological way. And that's true, but he kind of, because he's Martin Scorsese, so his films are damn cool. So you look at those films and you want to be a mobster in New York in a vintage environment. And that's kind of that wasn't his goal, but his aesthetic, his genre and his storytelling goals are in conflict with his stated, explicit, like political goals. So there's a tension, but that tension makes the work more interesting. But I think that if you then tell people that they are immoral for enjoying a Scorsese film, if he would tell us that we are immoral for creating the film that he made, that would not be fair. And I think this is similar. That's why the transparency is very helpful.
Thank you. So now we have a question that I think is very relevant for anyone who wants to start to design LARPs. This is also from Merke, who asks, what kind of actions do you usually design for the players or characters to do while they are in the LARP? And how do you get your players to do those things?
Okay, that is a massive question. But I think that the part of the answer is how do you get people to do anything in the real world? So I think if you wanna have a party in your home and you want people, so you can think about what kind of party would I like. I would like people to talk to each other. I would like people to dance, for instance. I would like strangers to talk to people they don't already know. There are things you can do with the physical environment and the social environment to help that. You can have one room when there's music, which is pretty loud, but it's also pretty dark so that it's not embarrassing to dance there. Maybe you have some flashing lights so that everybody who moves feels cool, whether they're good dancers or not. You will have another space that is not as loud and where the furniture is organized in a way, typically this will be your kitchen, by the way, that where it's more light so people can see each other's faces and that they will be naturally at about a 1 meter distance from each other. And maybe also you put in something for them to do, maybe help with dishes or prepare snacks or something, so that strangers will have natural reasons to interact with each other in this space. And this is how you get people to do things in the real world. And actually getting characters to do things is very similar. Another traditional way is that the characters want to do things, like all the characters have some agenda that they want to achieve in some way that is naturally offers itself to some specific types of activities. Then of course you need to make sure that it's possible to do those activities in the space. This may sound obvious, but again, 25, 30 years ago, I would go to a lot of fantasy LARPs where it was like, you are a potato farmer. That's what you do in this village. But there wasn't any farming to do. So I was just a person who sat around thinking about potatoes. And also, I didn't know anything about farming. So I was, as a player, not equipped to have conversations about potatoes. So you kind of need, but like it sounds, I'm making a joke now, but it kind of is that easy. You gotta figure out what the characters want, and then you gotta figure out what do the players need to be able to do the things. I will also say that if the verbs are what you want them to be doing mainly is to sit and to talk, or to lean ominously into each other and whisper, that often doesn't create a very dynamic environment. So you also want to enable people to, for instance, overhear things, like spy on a secret meeting and so on. You want to make sure that that can happen so that interesting events can occur in some way that is natural for your setting. In Parliament of Shadows, some characters were able to listen in on the secret meetings through the translator booth. But if you don't have a translator booth, maybe you have a window that you can intentionally leave open, or even make sure you can tell the characters they are not allowed to close this window, because the game will work better if people can accidentally hear them. Remember, the participants are on your side. They also want the cool story. So you can tell them to also, you can encourage them to participate in that.
Thank you. And yes, it's a huge question, but it's also a very relevant question, as you said. We have a question here from Melania, who asks, to create a meaningful and transformative experience, it's necessary to design the LARP in that direction. But apart from the in-role experience, what do you think about creating a workshop to let the players engage with the LARP and with the transformative focus? Is it possible, and how would you suggest to do that? Thank you so much.
That's a very good question. And so in LARP, we call a workshop typically is the activities that participants will be doing on site together to practice, workshop the verb, to practice anything that they may need to figure out together or co-create together or learn together before the actual runtime, when the period of time when the characters are played. Before that starts, they kind of need to be given and feel confident in everything that they need to be able to do to start playing. They will never feel 100% confident. So if you ask them, are you ready? They will always say, no, don't worry about that. That's a separate thing. So the question is, what can you do and what should you be doing with them while they are on site? And that depends so much on the design that it's difficult to answer that question. But I will say that the most valuable asset you have as a designer is time on site with your participants. And your participants will often want to play their characters for as long as possible. So you kind of need to negotiate. They will give you like a relatively small window of, let's say, a maximum of a third of the playtime, probably to use for workshopping or practice activities before the start of the LARP. And you may find when you start to plan your workshop that there are a bunch of things, like they need to learn this dance and they need to learn these names, and all of the families need to talk about what their Christmas traditions are, random examples, whatever that is. And then you find, wow, like now I've already used 2 hours and I only have 3. But then you have to go back again and think about, like, what are the themes of the work? Like and this is whether or not you want to make it transformative on purpose. You want to have a coherence between everything. Everything needs to go back to the themes. If you've been able to give them everything they need functionally to play the piece, yes, then I think you should use some time to do some reflection around the theme. And I think like a very simple way would do in groups, or if it's a small player group, everyone together in a circle, just to say one reflection perhaps of something related to the theme, what they are, something in their life that they are related to that theme. I think there's There was one LARP which wasn't designed to be transformative, but it was very powerful. It's a personal, like it was about breakup stories, about a destructive love story. And as part of the workshop of that, the 4 players in that small LARP are instructed to tell one real thing, like one negative breakup story or love story from their own life of some kind. I think it also says you're allowed to lie, so that the others will never know if it's true or not, but you are able to tell something true. And that's also a way to connect with in that case, it's intentionally, like you're connecting them to their memories. You're putting those memories into their body before they start playing. A little bit manipulative, but very elegant. And I think you can do versions of that just bringing the themes in some way into the space, into people's emotions, and it can even be through quiet reflection.
Okay, thank you so much. And I'm afraid we are running out of time already. It has been a delight to have you here, Johanna, as always, whenever we meet. If you want to, you can throw up your slide with contact information again, so everyone can see it.
Let's see if I can.
And meanwhile, I will also tell you that if you want to know when we are having more events like this with other speakers also, you can like the Transformative Play Initiative on Facebook. And we also have a mailing list that you can sign up for to keep updated. And we in the Transformative Play Initiative are part of something called the Games and Society Lab at the University of Uppsala that you can also like on Facebook. And there you can hear more about some larger initiatives within game design at Uppsala University.
Can I say a thing, Josefin, before we go?
Absolutely.
Well, I'd like to say thank you for everybody for your thoughtful questions. I'm sorry we couldn't answer them all. But also, wow, the Transformative Play Initiative, you guys, this is very interesting. And of course, to me, tonight is like the least interesting topic because I have already thought about this. But the rest of your season, very exciting. So thank you so much for putting that together.
Yes, and thank you for being part of it. And thank you everyone for showing up and listening and asking all your smart questions. And hopefully we get to see you next time around. Take care.